So, I suppose that I'll go over exactly why it's important for an association between two parties to be voluntary, since the author seems to understand that it's important for boosting the explanatory power of whatever position in an association he's attempting to defend, as evidenced by the fact that he goes through the effort to actually attempt to bullshit his readers into thinking that coercive state actions are voluntary by shifting the burden of proof onto the people who are being aggressed upon, and inventing arbitrary standards which don't actually prove anything on the part of the people whom force is being used against by the state, and doesn't just dismiss the arguments on the parts of libertarians altogether, but based on these attempts to explain how coercive actions are consensual, he clearly doesn't understand why it's important. Well, consent is important because it's the only way in which a moral agent is able to provably demonstrate that any association which they engaged in wasn't an act of aggression upon another person, and vice versa. This is because, as noted in my explanation earlier of what libertarian metaphysics assert, the logical conclusion of moral agency is the absolute dominion over the said moral agent self, their actions, and the products of their actions, this axiom commonly being referred to as self-ownership. Moral agents can't be free of dominion because that's contradicted by the observation of purposeful human action, and it's a logically fallacious position to attempt to declare dominion over another moral agent. Specifically, it would be an argument from special pleading. Another reason aside why I think it's important to establish this is that many statists, particularly because they either don't understand themselves or are desperately trying to pull one over on people because they think that their audience doesn't understand this, as you can see by this attempted rebuttal on Mike Cuban's part, regularly attempt to redefine words and concepts in order to superficially equate them with concepts which they're fundamentally not compatible with, also known as the equivocation fallacy, or will attempt to equate two incompatible concepts and compare them, also known as a false equivalence. And statists are doing this fundamentally when they attempt to appeal to the social contract. This is because it's rarely ever established or written about why exactly consent is so important in the establishment of foundational principles. It's just assumed that it is for most people, without them really ever thinking about why and what makes it so important. The suppression of this concept in mainstream discourse, on the other hand, is almost certainly intentional, because the establishment of moral agency into the question would undermine the state's narrative, which it attempts to build for how it's even legitimate in the first place. This being that consent necessarily has to be an actively asserted position on the part of every party that's involved in the association in question. Otherwise, there's no standard of proof which would hold someone accountable for their part of an agreement, or way to go about falsifying someone claiming that another person consented to an agreement. Could you imagine an insurance company trying to sue some random person on the grounds that they consented to a contract with no contract or proof that the other person had even communicated with the said insurance company? Or someone defending themselves after raping a girl in court unironically claiming that his victim consented because she happened to be on the same street as him, wearing certain clothing that was totally asking for it, because both of these arguments work on the exact same principle behind social contract theory. And not only would I imagine that pretty much any person making arguments for social contract theory would reject these two arguments based on the exact same reasoning they use to defend the state, but both of these things are things which themselves are declared illegitimate excuses if attempted to be argued for in the state's own courts. With this being established, it's really easy to understand why most statists appeal to moral relativism, because social contract theory has so little merit to it, and has been so thoroughly trashed, that if it wasn't for the fact that people from a young age in state societies are brainwashed into believing that their interests are interchangeable with that of the governments through government schools, no one in the 21st century would be unironically making this argument. In fact, I doubt that anyone would have ever sincerely proposed this argument in the first place, given that if you actually read Locke's Second Treatise of Government, his argument for the legitimacy of the social contract was more or less, yeah, it would be impossible for governments to obtain consent, so fuck everyone who doesn't consent, we're just going to ignore them and pretend they did. Paraphrasing, of course, but that's actually his argument. Also, libertarians don't reject force for the very reason which the author lays out here, only the initiation of force. So this is a straw man argument. Not to mention that the argument presented here contradicts the argument in the previous point regarding property itself being theft.